I now have great pleasure in introducing Dr. Reza Rajabiun. He's a visiting scholar at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson. His research investigates the relationship between the design of competition regulations, business behavior, and the evolution of market economies. He's an alumnus of the University of Connecticut, the Kiel Institute of World Economics, and the Osgood Law School at York University, where he has an LLM and a PhD.
My talk today this is a research program that Captain Milton, who you heard from earlier from Brazil or from the server. The idea behind this project, motivation behind this project, is that there's been basically an evolution in the policy, the broadband policy problem. A lot of focus has been on access. This is changing. One of the questions in the last session was about intelligent networks and going beyond speeds. This is changing to a great deal, particularly in advanced countries like Canada, where some form of internet connectivity exists. So if you believe CRTC's data of access, there is 100% coverage in urban and 85% in rural areas. And the details of this data and how they arrived at it and how it's changed over time was discussed in the last session. And at the same time, Canada is very interesting, although there is little data on this. Consumers, Canadian end users, look like they have a lot of demand for high-speed connectivity. So more than 50% of those who subscribe to high-speed internet subscribe to plans that are faster than 5 megabits per second. The problem with this focus on access is that the diffusion of second-generation internet applications like multimedia and cloud computing, IPTV, rapidly eats up the capacity, the installed capacity base as it's delivered. So in a small neighborhood, you have a couple of teenagers that are gaming a lot. Nobody else will be able to really do much, depending on the capacity that has been installed. So this is a emergence of congestion on links and routers, particularly localized congestion, particularly say between 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 10 o'clock at night, is one of the key infrastructure challenges in broadband. So you could have very fast advertised speeds or maximum speeds, but the actual network performance that you are getting, even with the intelligent network that is adjusting the quality of the connection depending on the application that's being used. So this transition in policy focus makes it more important to have measures of quality of experience that end users actually experience as benchmarks, for example, for all the different studies that we saw being proposed in the last section of how to measure economic impact. Access rates there is going to be some marginal improvements in access with kind of rural programs that we have in Canada and elsewhere, but that's not necessarily going to be a very strong, and it doesn't have that much informational value in identifying and benchmarking networks. So previous research in this area on broadband policy generally focuses on national differences, focusing on regulation of competition at the interconnection level, and also on the level of industrial policy in terms of subsidies for private sector to deal with market failures. There's little analysis of policy at the subnational level, and it makes sense to the degree that the important aspects of the institutional framework for the operation of the broadband market, telecommunications market, are centralized at the national level. There are some case studies of particular policy options at local levels and a couple of older studies on US states. And there's actually a recent study on different approaches to municipal governance that they try to compare in Europe. And the basic conclusion is that the difference in local models are not that important, and the national framework is extremely important for driving the overall results of the lower level policies, broadband promotion policies by lower levels of government. So this paper has 3 objectives. One is, the first two are more general. what we want to do is characterize the differences in development of internet connectivity in Canada. There isn't, as we know, CRTC doesn't collect data independently, and there is various, unlike various other governments that have been trying to set up an infrastructure to monitor how the internet infrastructure is developing, and monitor and then identify gaps in the system. So what we did here is, this is in collaboration with Akamai Technologies, which is a content delivery network. They say that they carry 30% of the internet traffic, but that's on their front page. So, but they are very large. They're the largest content delivery network. And what they do is basically they're an intermediary between content providers and the end users. So they optimize, they accelerate big transfer of data flows depending on particular applications. So what their data is particularly good as an indicator of the quality of end user experience, particularly for second generation applications. For things like email and simple web browsing, speed is pretty much irrelevant because of the structure of the TCP/IP protocol, which adjusts it. And second objective is to look at the possible reasons for these observed differences, and if their observed differences are significant enough. And then to stimulate, I'll end it with some discussion of different models of designing public-private partnerships for rural broadband development, and provide some benchmarks based on this Akamai data that can be used to measure the pace of progress. So there is an important, I don't think we've discussed it so far in this conference, is the general framework why these rural broadband policies are becoming important in Canada, and also more pressure on local governments in general, even in urban areas. The evolution of the Canadian broadband is puzzling. And we had a puzzle in the morning. Economists like their puzzles. So the puzzle is that in the late 90s and early 2000s, Canada expanded internet connectivity more rapidly than other advanced countries. And since this period, we've had strong capital expenditures in the telecommunications sector in Canada, much stronger than the average for other high-income countries. After the collapse of the early 2000s bubble, in all countries, capital expenditures in telecom declined, but they recovered. But in Canada, they recovered very fast. So as early as 2004, 2005, you see quite a bit of capital expenditures going into the sector. Unfortunately, the disaggregated data for capital expenditures in broadband is not available. It's a big trade secret. So all we have is at the national level, and many attempts to tease it out of various agencies and departments, but it's not coming out. So we need to look at it in a different way. We don't really need investment data. We need outcome data to be able to evaluate what's going on and where we are and where the system is going and where investment opportunities for the private sector and how public sector can complement them. So and the second puzzle with Canada is that we have the highest level of platform competition in the world between cable and DSL. So this is particularly puzzling for the economic models that say you might have, if you have more firms, it's better in a sense. But the reason for this, and there is some evidence from the US, that actually duplication can be very costly in this sector. So that might explain why we have higher capital expenditures, but we have increasingly worse outcomes relative to other countries. So this was noticed by the Telecom Policy Review Panel in 2006, and not surprisingly, they said that we need to strengthen the essential facilities regime, in particular take the power to adjudicate disputes between third parties and incumbents to a different venue than the CRTC. So basically, we remove that power from the CRTC because of various reasons that you know about. And also relaxing barriers to foreign control. As you heard, there hasn't been much done with this. There was some relaxation of entry barriers this summer, and I think there's a talk on this later on, and this has I'll touch upon it. It has some implications for rural broadband development, and generally the ability and the cost lower levels, subnational levels of government face if they want to do something about the digital infrastructure problems that they're seeing. But there hasn't been much on the essential facilities regulation side. And there was a very interesting question this morning about if the Eastern Ontario Regional Network has adopted a contractual approach to try to keep the points of presence open or not to third parties. But I guess the answer is no. But we see British Columbia has taken a different approach to this question. So the end result of this status quo bias at the national level is that you have increasing demand on provinces, municipalities to do something. To do something, you need reliable benchmarks to sort of measure the pace of progress in network development, and then evaluate alternative policy design strategies. The perspective behind this research is that basically network deployment is fundamentally a local process. So you need to estimate how much demand there is and then dig the holes and put the lines in. But the key is the estimation of demand. But there's large economies of scale in the administration of networks. So you get platform-level consolidation, structural dominance, which leads to policy centralization. In theory, it's not really clear where the allocation of policy is optimal, which level of government should try to be doing something about this. So what we get is a problem of multi-level governance in infrastructure development, which is also a key issue in various other jurisdictions, large federations, where there is a big heterogeneity of demand and also demand and potential problems of information overload at the center. So my co-author is in Brazil right now and talking about these issues, sort of, because they do also have a decentralized approach to this, and the coordination problems between the central and the subnational levels is becoming pretty tense. So they are searching for other ways of organizing this. I won't go through the basic arguments why it might be better to have lower levels of government be doing something about this. Under Canada's constitutional system, lower levels of government, provinces specifically, not the municipalities. Municipalities don't have so much power relative to, say, US municipals. Provinces are responsible for delivering the social and business infrastructure that could, in theory, although some people say that maybe there isn't that much to this, in theory, help promote health and education and business, so it has positive externalities. So they might have stronger incentives than a federal government, which does not directly manage and pay for healthcare and education. But they have limited ability relative to the central government. Raising public funds is more expensive, although you still get the debt guarantee. But some levels of government cannot actually raise those public funds. So, and also technical capabilities and administration. And there's also local governments usually have better uses for their money, for example, dealing with social issues. But there's a number of important economic reasons, but actually decentralization in this area might be the first best solution. One is sort of differentiation and attracting knowledge-intensive firms, which there's quite a bit of evidence of this in the US. There is the issue of market-preserving federalism, that actually decentralization can increase the level of investment, incentives of the private sector to invest. So, and this is important as we're talking about interconnection regulation and rural broadband, in that if the essential facilities regulation at the central level are very weak, which is in relative terms, there's general agreement that that's the case in Canada. Third-party operators may not have incentives to go into specific local markets, and then we call that market failure, because the fixed cost of actually interconnecting with the incumbents in terms of red tape, and also there is a regulated price, but beyond that there is quite a bit of regulatory barriers to entry to actually interconnect. So, so going around the weak essential facilities regulation can actually increase private sector incentives to invest in places they wouldn't, like the rural and distant areas. You can also have instrumental specialization, and there's some research on this, that it's optimal to have the essential facilities at the central level, but subsidies should be delivered by the local government. And we come back to this at the end of the Canadian conference. And most important is that to learn from other people's experiences. And this is why we are here, to find out about different models of delivering rural broadband and which ones work better. But for that, we need data. But more generally, we can think of it as a second best solution. We know the Telecom Policy Review Panel and the government's own report basically show that they know what's going on and what could be done to help it, to deal with it. But these policy options are not politically feasible. So decentralization, engagement by the provinces and municipalities can be a second best solution in this context. Okay, so what I have here, we'll go into some pictures. What we have is two measurements from two different test beds. What I want to emphasize here is that the different speed measurements that you hear about, they represent very different perspectives into a complex world of internet connectivity. So what we have here is data from Akamai, which is a content delivery network, and from Speedtest, which is a popular site for testing your speeds. And as you see, the measures that come from Speedtest are twice as much as those from Akamai. There's a bunch of reasons for this, and I won't get into the details of them. And there's also other tests that anybody that's interested, we can discuss on how they can be incorporated into evaluating specific programs that you might be running in your provinces or countries. But one reason, an important reason, is that speed tests might have user-generated tests might have a sample selection bias. So people that are actually testing their own internet are people that have already, they have demand for speed, so they want to have a high-speed connection. So one reason is for that. Second reason is that speed test has a lot of clients that include the big incumbent operators in the US and Canada. So they actually use speed tests for their customer service. So you actually get the magnitude. I've tested this on my own. Sometimes you get a difference in the magnitude of 20 times the difference between speed test and NDT test, which is a more fancy research-oriented test that you actually get the detail of it, and it's more independent than speed test. So you need to be very careful about what measures are actually used as targets, whether you're incorporating into the contracts or not. But in general, this gives us a provincial picture of internet connectivity as of 2011. But sort of static, and I'll get, okay.
Sir,
sorry.
just ask one, on your previous slide, if I just look
Yes,
across, what you're saying is, just looking across generally here,
Yep.
that the speed test actually is, the results are twice what they are in Akamai?
Yes. Yes. And I've had
So who's cheating on this?
It's not cheating. There are different perspectives. There's different reasons for this. And I'll come, well, there might be some cheating too. I'm not saying, I'm not defending.
Hey, look.
There might be some cheating too.
What's the case? So there's got to be some bias here, either one way or another.
Okay, now there's a lot of technical differences. There's some, but from a business strategic point of view, which I understand given your last question, what your perspective is on this issue, is that their clients, they're
Question in this room or over there?
Yeah, over there. I don't know, doing this one. The business model,
Talk about that later.
Speedtest business model is that they build these partnerships with different companies and they have servers everywhere. So what they're trying to make money of is that they sell services to the incumbent operators. So individuals can test their own. So you call, say, I won't use names. Okay, you call one of the incumbent operators customer service, say, oh, I'm paying $60 a month for this super duper thing, internet connection, but I'm not getting anything. What they do is they connect you to speed test, say, oh, test it, and then you see that you're actually, they say, oh, you're getting what you are paying for. But speed test knows exactly who your provider is and what your the packaging pricing is, the package that you have. So if you cross-check that test with, say, NDT test, which is from MLabs, sometimes you get a huge difference So again, need to be very careful about these. And Akamai, you can actually get the same, why it might be low, is that what their business model is that their job is to accelerate content flows to end users. So the infrastructure operators have incentives to actually slow them down. So they might throttle data traffic that's coming directly from Akamai. So Netflix, for example, I think they had it's been back and forth. So Netflix was Akamai's client in delivering, and then what basically happened is that Netflix has been making deals with the operators separately, and they're isolating Akamai now out of the market. So Netflix Canada, I think, dropped Akamai. So you're getting this strategic maneuvering, over-throttling, and what traffic flows can go through the system. Please, and don't worry about jumping in I don't mind. It's more smart. Anyone? Okay,
Okay, so I can conclude from that they're cheating. All right.
Yes. It's an interesting world.
I mean, our user experience is, users know that.
Users know that.
They know that, you know, if you advertise 7 meg, you're not delivering 7 meg. Users know that.
Exactly.
They're not, you know, them.
They know that.
It's no different than high school grades.
Yeah.
He's coming out getting an A.
Yeah. Exactly. So we're all happy and leading world experiences. Oh yeah, and around this, of course. Sorry, please stop me if I go over half an hour again. There is also their whole world of litigation around this between Rogers and Bell and oops, I use names, but that's public record. About which one is the best and how to calculate, but none of the courts have actually looked at concrete data. So they're giving these decisions with basically very broad principles, and you get a lot of inconsistency across the different courts in the country. So one time this judge sides with this company, the next time that. So there is no real processing system, but basically money for lawyers. Okay, so since they're both not very good, but Akamai is better. This is a picture, we add them up we averaged them for a more balanced picture of what's going on across the country, or what was going on in 2011. And what you see is that beside the outliers, everybody is within 20% of the average, provincial average. And now we dig more deep into this. And one reason for this, the lack of variation, and that's one area of research, is to compare the variation across different countries, I believe, is the national regulatory framework. So in the US, you get a lot more variation in the quality of connectivity across the countries, regionally. Okay, this is, I guess, the most interesting from a technical perspective, and demonstrate what's been happening to the internet and why are we caring about internet infrastructure over the past few years more and more, and how it's performing. This is a picture of this is of 2 different speed measurements. One is the peak speed, which is the fastest that the network can handle or is detected by Akamai servers, and the second one is average speed. So this is based on, I have monthly data. Okay, I'll get to that later. So what we see here is the sort of reflection of adoption of second-generation internet applications over the past few years. The operators have had to increase the amount of excess capacity that they put into the network quite a bit, almost twice. They had to double the amount of excess capacity that they put in networks because of that large demand that you get, particularly from residential customers in the evenings. And this is the difference between these two is actually sort of the research area that Steve Bauer and the MIT Broadband Research Group are focusing on, and they just had a very interesting paper at TPRC that they go through. They have data from Roger. They made some non-disclosure agreements with a bunch of big telcos, and they have the data, so they don't break it down and you can't see it, but they have very interesting perspective on what actually happens during the day and why it's so important that this gap between excess capacity and when nobody wants to use the internet. So average rate should be viewed as when you want to actually use the internet. But over time, you might be able to, and I guess the hope of my research program is that to separate the effect of supply and demand on the actual quality of the infrastructure by looking at the difference between peak and average performance over time. So what we have is basically, this is just focusing on using Akamai data. These are constructed from monthly measures from their servers, which gives us a picture of the quality of internet connectivity over time, how much it has grown. So you see there's a significant difference between the two provinces that have had very active, relatively active provincial policies towards internet infrastructure development, which are Alberta and British Columbia. And the Atlantic provinces sort of fall behind this. But in the paper, I go through a bunch of different benchmarks of this that can be used by others, or by policymakers more specifically, to try to figure out whether they need to be doing anything and how they should be doing it. We also see, in addition to this difference in the level of growth in the speed of the internet, is that we have very different patterns across the country too. So here we have both average monthly growth rates and median growth rates over time. We see that in general, the development of the infrastructure is not normally distributed, which means that how it develops and how you increase the speed it happens with a small number of large projects rather than in a more smooth fashion. But you see that in British Columbia and Quebec, we have probably the most normally distributed pace of growth. So this is suggestive, and Alberta with the SuperNet has very distributed growth over time, which symmetrically distributed, which makes sense in the sense that it was a large scale government project. So when they lit it up, it started flowing. So, but in British Columbia and Quebec, we see that there is more of that normal distribution is indicative that the operators in those areas might have been better at estimating demand and planning how to respond to it over time. So they didn't suddenly, they just invested and waited, and then lots of calls come into customer service. Oh, this is not working, this is not working, and then they wait after a few years or months, and then they invest. So it's in British Columbia and Quebec, it looks like that has been less of a case than in other provinces to delay those investments. So it's been a more smooth process. So what are some of the reasons behind this? One is geography. There is a clear connection, but again, we don't have too many data points, so we can't really do anything statistical with this. And it needs to be expanded to other countries to say anything more concrete, particularly because policy, although it's easy to get data for more disaggregated data for lower levels of, in Canada, there is no policy variables unless you're talking about rural policy programs, which is a separate issue, and these measures that we discussed, they're not appropriate for it. So geography is something, but it's not necessarily everything. Because as you see, New Brunswick is pretty sparsely populated, but it's generally performance growth was not so bad. But there's a reason for that, that may be a demand side issue. On the demand side, there's also, you see, the causality between supply and demand is sort of ambiguous. So people won't use the internet for downloading movies or using more sophisticated applications if it's not working so well. So sometimes even in Toronto with my fast connection, I barely can download a PDF at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So, so if you don't have that capacity, then people are not willing to necessarily adopt those technologies. So they get tired of it, and they stay, instead of using Netflix and paying $8 a month, they use something else, and pay the $150 a month. So, and so the relationship is not clear, but there is a nonlinear relationship makes sense. But it's hard to say whether BC has the highest performing US internet because there was demand for it, or there was the firms and the policymakers were able to create such an environment that that demand was met. And finally, we have platform competition. There's sort of a relationship, but what is interesting is that Alberta, it clearly falls out of this picture, and it provides a way to capture why their approach was this. So public investment in internet backbone in this context can be viewed as a substitute to competition from cable operators. So Alberta has a relatively high performance, has had relatively fast growth in the quality of the infrastructure, but level of platform competition is low. And also, Saskatchewan is very low. So, and that might have something to do, and that probably does, with the existence of the continuation of public ownership. Okay, and sort of another final reason, potential explanation for this, is the differences in the policy environment. So in Alberta and BC, we have the provincial governments leverage government procurement as a way of promoting broadband development. So I won't get into Alberta too much because we'll have a presentation after this on that topic. You have the backbone investment in the infrastructure, and one of the objectives of the Alberta SuperNet was, in addition to connecting the government buildings, was to promote rural broadband, but that has not happened. And more recently, they've started to put more rural grants. And the key reason for that is that third parties have not been able to interconnect at the local pubs that they have set up in Alberta. So, and TELUS, oh, sorry, I keep on using companies. Okay, and the incumbent operator, has little incentive to actually grant third parties that last mile connection. The approach in British Columbia has been very different, although it revolves around procurement, is that they basically try to co-opt the incumbent operator. They've adopted two exclusive contractual contracts with the incumbent that basically part of the contractual guarantee is to keep open access to the pubs in rural areas. So, and that has worked out better. And actually, in the least recent one, they have some hard performance targets on speed too, that they need to increase speed. Because what they did with the first contract was that, okay, you're increasing speed, but then they realize that as soon as they say we have broadband and now we are reaching 1.5 or 5 megabits per second, then the whole thing crashes because everybody starts using second generation. Not everybody, more people start using second generation technologies. So it's not sustainable. And the question of sustainability has been raised quite a bit today. And this is a very important element of that. If you don't have a well-designed interconnection regulation or a contractual way of going around it, so this can be very easily incorporated into any subsidy schemes or private-public partnerships that are arranged. In Quebec, Ontario, we have basically rural subsidies. There hasn't been much else. And before I go back, on the costs of these are, in the BC case, is the 20-year procurement lock-ins for telecommunication services for a lot of government ministries. On the BC government website, if you look at it, they say that this rural achievement was done without any cost to the taxpayer. But they don't mention that they actually have committed a lot of hospitals, a bunch of ministries, and various other government entities to use for telephones, any IT services with the incumbent. So the costs are not very clear.
But the results speak for themselves. We did a better job in BC.
Yes.
Having participated in that one in the early days.
Yeah.
We did a better job in BC than we did in Alberta, although Alberta was very successful as well. If I look at Ontario and Quebec, we totally get defeated by Bell Canada in Ontario and Quebec.
because there is no
So the
recognition.
results in Alberta and BC speak highly.
And because there is no recognition of the regulatory problem at the center, and that's the effect. That's the multi-level effect of this. No matter what you do, it becomes the same thing.
Well, in BC, all we did there was we used the carrot and stick approach. It worked.
Yeah. But I'll come back to that, actually. You'll see on the difference, it makes a difference on something else. And on the Atlantic provinces, you have, I think, in the case of New Brunswick, you have outflows of sort of younger population, so there is less demand. But in Prince Edward Rhode Island and Nova Scotia, you see a stronger demand, imputed demand from this. But in New Brunswick, sorry, let me go back. Okay, sorry, this is getting long. We'll discuss, if you're interested, I can discuss, get into the details later. I'll get to the rural stuff. So basically, the idea here is that we have these different approaches to program design for rural areas. So the BC approach was to give small grants, exclude the incumbent from bidding for those grants, and they didn't, and they're given to various kinds of organizations. So the maximum grant was 50,000. So most of the grants were around 50,000, and in 120 projects, and the long-term procurement lock-in, of course. And in Alberta excluded the incumbent, so did not allow the local to create the network backbone. So they actually brought in the incumbent from here to make up their backbone. So, and that gives, so TELUS was excluded from the Alberta's program design.
I just wanted to
please.
make a note through an open, fair, competitive procurement process. So we didn't exclude the incumbent from participating in the network. We had competition and one won over the other.
Yes.
Just wanted to be clear as we have a number of folks.
But
Sorry.
if I may go back, if I can count, sorry, time? How much?
You have 5 minutes,
Okay.
and then then you're done.
Yes. Yes. 5 minutes on questions or 5 minutes on done?
Well, you're finished in 5 minutes, so
Okay.
if you'd like to questions, then you should stop now.
Okay, then I'll go quickly. Okay, but the amount of procurement guarantee is not disclosed in the BC case. So there's other kinds of design approaches, and the Ontario Rural Connection, I won't go through them because since we don't have time. The key, the point that I'm trying to make with this presentation here is that there is not much disclosure of what is actually happening with these programs. So there isn't, there is some government entities are publishing, most of them are just publishing aggregate data on program inputs. So how many households we're trying to serve and how much money is going into it. What we don't know, and they don't even publish that at the disaggregated level, at the project level data. And what is not usually published, and I am assuming is not collected, is the outcome indicators. So what is actual, if they are getting 1.5, or for what percentage of the time. And this goes back to the misleading advertising issue that we saw, the gap between peak and, could you give me 1 second? I'll do it very quickly. Between the growing gap between peak and average speeds. As that gap is growing, they're getting these concerns about misleading more and more concerns about misleading advertising. So what is actually in the retail contract and what is being delivered is diverging faster over time. And this is the key for rural broadband programs. It might be important to actually motivate people that are getting the subsidies to do the retail contracts, not in the standard format, but using some sort of average or weighted average of deliverable speeds. So, but not much data is being produced, and the third party's data is not really appropriate for this. What is needed is to actually put in program-specific test beds, which is very cheap to do. So for $40, $50 per household, we can put testing methodology for a sample of a couple of hundred households, and basically monitor this very easily. There's third-party companies that do this. There's open source software and can be done very easily. But as far as I'm aware, and please correct me if I'm wrong, this is the right place to ask this question, is anybody actually monitoring what the speeds are after the subsidies program has been delivered? So, and this is the government entity that is actually the most transparent is the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Cultural Affairs. Thank you. And because they publish public project relevant data. So what we get, this is I have some estimates in this to get to this, but what we see is that we have a power law distribution of the cost. This kind of approach can